Hey everyone, and welcome to your deep dive. Today we're diving into something that I think is super relevant to all of us. How those big ideas of patriarchy and feminism actually show up in our relationships.
Absolutely.
We're taking a deep dive into this podcast we found, Patriarchy versus Feminism, Navigating Relationships in a Changing World, from a show called Love Unlocked.
I'm intrigued.
And don't worry, we're not trying to pick sides here or tell you what to think, okay?
Yeah.
We just want to unpack these concepts, see how they might be playing out in our own love lives, maybe even without us realizing it.
Yeah, it's interesting how we often think about romantic relationships as separate from all those big societal structures. Like they exist in their own little bubble. But, when you really think about it, they're kind of like these mini reflections of those broader patterns, right?
Totally. They're like these little microcosms. And that's exactly what this podcast really digs into.
Yeah.
Like right off the bat, they start by defining patriarchy as a social system where men hold more of the power. And that power dynamic, it influences everything from our culture and laws to get this family dynamics.
Right, right.
And their explanation of patriarchy, it really hit home for me because it's not about saying all men are bad or anything like that. It's more about this system, this structure that's been around for so long that often ends up benefiting men, maybe at the expense of others. And sometimes it's like, even if you consciously try to challenge those patterns, they're just so deeply ingrained that it's hard.
It really is. And that's where feminism comes in, right? The podcast contrasts it as this idea of advocating for equal rights and opportunities, regardless of gender. Because it's not about one gender winning over the other. It's about dismantling those ingrained power imbalances that we see in patriarchal systems. It's about creating a more equitable playing field for everyone. Like, take, for example, a woman who's expected to handle all the housework and childcare, even when she's also working full time.
Oh, I know, right?
That reflects a larger societal expectation, right?
Yeah.
This unspoken assumption that women are naturally responsible for all the domestic labor, even when they're contributing equally in other areas.
Okay, so understanding those definitions, that's like step one. But where this podcast gets really, really fascinating is when they unpack how patriarchy specifically shows up in romantic relationships.
Absolutely. Because these power dynamics, they don't magically disappear when we enter into romantic relationships, right? In fact, they often manifest in some very subtle ways. It's so true. One of the first examples they give is traditional gender roles. And it just got me thinking about those classic romantic comedies where the guy is always expected to pick up the check, It's like it's this given.
Right, and it seems harmless enough in a movie, right?
Yeah.
But in real life, those seemingly small things, they reinforce this bigger idea that men should be the providers in a relationship. And over time, that can actually impact the financial dynamics and even the emotional expression within the relationship.
That's so true. And it's not just about, like, who pays for dinner,
Yeah.
It's those deeper expectations that come with it. Which actually leads us to another point the podcast delves into, this whole idea of emotional labor, which I found super insightful. Have you ever heard of that term?
Oh, absolutely. Emotional labor is so important to discuss. It refers to that often invisible work of managing emotions in a relationship. Yes. And it really struck a chord with me because I've totally felt that pressure in past relationships to be the one who remembers everyone's birthdays, plans, outings, always make sure everyone's feeling okay. It's like not only are you processing your own feelings, but you're also expected to anticipate and manage your partner's emotions as well.
Absolutely.
It's a lot. And listening to that podcast, it just made me realize how easy it is to fall into those patterns without even questioning them,
It's so true. And it raises these really important questions for all of us to consider. How are we actually handling emotional responsibility in our own relationships? Are we communicating our needs openly and honestly, or are we falling into these expected roles without even realizing it?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, where are those lines?
It does.
Okay, so we've been talking about how patriarchy can kind of sneak into our relationships. But what about the flip side? What about feminism's role in all of this?
Right.
I really appreciated how this podcast framed it because they were coming at it from this angle of, like, feminism's impact is a positive thing. Like, it's not this scary word,
Right. It's not about tearing something down. It's about building something new, right? It's about recognizing that feminism ultimately seeks to create more equitable and fulfilling relationships for everyone involved, right? Not just women, everyone.
Yes. And I love how they talked about how it encourages couples to share responsibilities more equally. Open communication, honesty, and just supporting each other's growth as individuals, which I think is huge.
Absolutely. It's not about one gender winning over the other. It's about fostering relationships that are built on this foundation of mutual respect and equality, where both partners truly feel seen, heard, and valued.
100%. And, this whole idea of challenging those old school norms, like the ones we've been talking about, that really came across strongly. In fact, they actually brought in this feminist scholar, and they quoted her as saying something like, "Feminism empowers us as individuals to challenge those traditional norms and advocate for relationships that are truly equitable."
It's a powerful statement for sure, because it highlights how we don't have to accept the relationship script that we've been handed, right?
Wow.
We have the power to question those deeply ingrained beliefs about how relationships should be and create something that's way more authentic and fulfilling for us.
Yes. And I think that's so important to remember. Okay, so the podcast definitely didn't shy away from the tough stuff either. They actually got really real about the challenges of putting these ideas, patriarchy and feminism, into practice, especially in the context of a romantic relationship.
Of course. And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because it's one thing to intellectually grasp these concepts, but navigating them in our day-to-day lives within a relationship, that's a whole other story.
Totally. And they mentioned resistance to change as being a really big hurdle for a lot of couples.
Mhm.
And they shared this story about this one couple who was trying to redefine their roles at home, like who does what. And it actually caused a ton of tension and arguments, which, when you think about it, it makes sense.
It does make sense. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
We're all products of our upbringing, right? Societal conditioning, it's so powerful. And those deeply ingrained beliefs about gender roles, they don't just disappear overnight just because we want them to. Unlearning those patterns, it takes real conscious effort. It takes open communication. And it takes that willingness to really step back and examine our own assumptions.
Like, even if both partners are totally on board with having this more equal partnership, breaking free from those old patterns can still be really tough.
It is, because it's not always obvious, right? Because they are such deeply ingrained societal patterns. You run into these misunderstandings and someone might think they're being more progressive than they actually are in practice, right?
Yeah.
Their actions might not quite match up, and that creates a disconnect.
Oh, for sure. And that reminds me of this one time. Oh my gosh, yeah. Those disconnects, they can be so frustrating. Like, you'd think you're on the same page.
Yeah.
But anyway, I did love that the podcast didn't just dump all these challenges on us and then peace out.
Right.
They actually gave us some really practical tips for couples who want to try to build this more balanced and fulfilling relationship, which I thought was really helpful.
Yeah, it's great when they can offer those solutions, because knowledge is great, but without action, it doesn't really get us very far, right?
Exactly. Like, one thing they suggested, which I thought was interesting, was setting shared goals as a couple.
Oh, that's huge. That's so important, because it's like you're both working towards this same vision,
Yeah.
right? And it creates that sense of really being partners in the truest sense of the word. And then those little day-to-day challenges, they feel so much more manageable, because you're like, we're in this together, It's not me versus you, it's us.
Totally. They also talked about active listening, which I feel like we hear about that all the time,
Right.
But the podcast actually broke it down in a way that made sense for couples.
Yeah.
'Cause it's not just about sitting there waiting for your turn to talk, right?
So much more than that.
It's about really, truly trying to understand your partner's perspective,
Yeah.
even if you don't agree with it.
Mm.
Even if you're like, oh my God, here we go again,
Yeah, and it requires us to really flex those empathy muscles, right?
Yeah.
To be patient and really listen with an open heart and an open mind. Which, let's be honest, it can be difficult sometimes, especially when we're triggered or feeling defensive. But the rewards, in terms of building true intimacy, are immense. It's so important. And it made me realize, it's not just about having those big, intense relationship conversations. It's about bringing that kind of awareness and intentionality to even the small moments,
Yeah.
Like, how are we showing up in those little everyday interactions? And are we really present with each other? Or are we just kind of going through the motions? And they talked a lot about, having each other's backs. Like, when you're in a relationship, you're a team, and you're facing those societal norms together.
It's about recognizing that we don't have to accept the relationship script that we've been handed by society, right? We have the power to define what a truly equitable and fulfilling relationship looks like for us.
I love that. And speaking of empowering, I really appreciated how they ended on such a hopeful note. Like, they talked about celebrating the progress that we have made.
Yeah.
Because, things are different now than they were even a generation ago, right?
But also acknowledging that, there's still work to be done. And advocating for change, not just in our own relationships, but also in the world around us. And like even small actions can make a difference.
They absolutely do. And it's that whole idea, right, that we're not alone in this journey. And when we share our experiences and we support each other and we're brave enough to challenge those outdated norms and expectations, it creates this ripple effect that extends far beyond ourselves.
100%. And one quote that really stuck with me was, every small step towards equality, it contributes to this bigger cultural shift. And I love that.
It's a beautiful reminder, and it speaks to the power that we each hold to create positive change in the world.
It really does. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really got me thinking about all of this. And I think for me, the big takeaway is that understanding these concepts of patriarchy and feminism, it's not just some intellectual exercise.
Mhm.
It's about actually taking that knowledge and looking at our own relationships with fresh eyes and asking ourselves, how can we create something that feels more balanced, more fulfilling, and really authentic to who we are, both as individuals and as a couple?
Yes, and recognizing that we're not striving for perfection, right?
Yeah.
But that ongoing process of growth, communication, and that willingness to learn and evolve together.
Love that. Well, that's it for today's deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought, and who knows, maybe even spark some interesting conversations with your partner. Until next time.
See you next time.